Hi everyone, welcome to part 3, Acid-Base Imbalances of Unit 8. In today's lessons, we're going to go through various acid-base imbalances, specifically respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, and then metabolic alkalosis. Please remember to read chapters 24 and 25 while always referring to the learning outcomes in the syllabus. Please also note that in this particular lesson, we are going to be doing a lot of problem solvings based upon those three values of pH, PCO2, and bicarbonate. Let's start off with a few definitions. We learned in ENP1 and probably in high school itself about this measure of acidity called pH. So pH is really a measure of how acidic or alkaline a solution is. And in terms of the relationship between pH and acidity, it's a inverse relationship. In other words, as acidity increases, pH decreases. As acidity decreases, pH increases. So in this particular unit, we're going to be looking at really how do we regulate blood plasma levels such that it remains within 7.35 to 7.45 normal range. In other words, how do we achieve acid-base homeostasis? It's all about maintaining the pH in that normal range. Before that, you have to know the definition of an acid, a proton donor, and a base, which is a proton acceptor. A couple more terms. Technically speaking, acidemia is when the pH of arterial blood is less than 7.35. But we use the term acidosis to refer to all the physiological or pathophysiological processes and whatever associated reactions that result in acidemia. So when you see pH of less than 7.35, we almost always say it's acidosis, because we are talking not just about, yes, obviously it's acidemia, but what exactly causes the acidemia. So we'll say respiratory acidosis or metabolic acidosis. So although the two terms are not synonymous, they're mainly used as synonyms of each other. So really acidemia is just the characteristic of blood plasma pH being less than 7.35, and acidosis is all the processes that lead to the blood plasma pH being less than 7.35. Similarly, alkalemia is when blood pH, arterial blood pH, plasma levels is greater than 7.45, and alkalosis is all the processes that lead to alkalemia. So we tend to use, again, respiratory alkalosis or metabolic alkalosis to refer to all the processes that result in blood plasma pH being greater than 7.45. Let's talk about the two types of acids that are present in the body. So the way I like to describe it is you can think of two pots in our body. There are two pots of acids in our body. One pot contains the volatile acid, which is really just CO2. So the key point here is that CO2 is an acid. We all know this because assuming everyone's had a carbonated beverage, you've actually seen that CO2 is an acid, or at least felt that CO2 is an acid. That's because in the presence of water, CO2 forms carbonic acid, and then it dissociates to form the proton, which is the acid, and bicarbonate. So when you drink any carbonated beverage, why do you feel that tingling sensation on your tongue? Well, it's literally the carbon dioxide reacting with the water on your tongue to produce carbonic acid. You're literally burning your tongue. But fortunately, there's very little carbonic acid produced, because in order to form more carbonic acid, you need the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, of which there is none present on our tongue. So that's why all that CO2 doesn't get converted to carbonic acid. Some of it does, and that's why you get that tingly reaction. Regardless, the bottom line is you have to know that CO2 is an acid. It is an acid, and it will always be an acid. So that's one big part of acid in our body, all the CO2 that we produced. And the other big part is all the non-volatile acids. So basically everything else other than CO2. Anything else that can potentially be an acid, we lump that in that second category over there. That could be sulfuric acid, which is a product of protein catabolism. So when you break down proteins, some amino acids such as cysteine contain sulfur and you get sulfuric acid. Phosphoric acid, which is a metabolic byproduct of the breakdown of phospholipids. And there are various other acids such as lactic acid, keto acids, which are produced when you break down fats instead of glucose. So instead of carbohydrates, so you start breaking down fats, so you get these so-called ketone bodies, and then generate those ketone bodies are acids as well, so called keto acids. So in type 1 diabetes mellitus, when no insulin is present, then you can uptake glucose into fat and muscle cells. So the fat and muscle cells have to use fatty acids as a fuel source. But what the problem is, when you break down fatty acids, you'll end up with these keto acids. It's an acid, so that's another big source of all these other acids in our body. Lactic acids, when you don't have enough oxygen, for example, lack of blood supply, reduced tissue perfusion, then you will switch to anaerobic respiration to generate only two ATP molecules per glucose, but the problem is you generate lactic acid as a byproduct. So sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, which is the main acid in the stomach, phosphoric acid, keto acid, lactic acids, all of these are acids that are produced in the body. We lump that in the other part. Even exogenous drugs that we take, like aspirin, acetylsalicylic acid, that can also be a source of all the other acids in our body. So two big parts, CO2 on one side, all the other acids on the other side, and they have to be in balance with each other. I'm speaking too fast over here. So if you have too much CO2, it's bad. If you have too much of the other acids, it's bad. But sometimes one can compensate for the other. So if you have too little CO2, it's bad, but you can try to compensate for it by having a little bit more of all the other acids in the body in order to re-achieve homeostasis. So we'll talk about compensation. Compensation is really the balancing of these two parts of acids. So you have to balance the amount of CO2 with all the other acids, and that's what we'll talk about a bit later on. Another very important concept in acid-base homeostasis is the use of buffers. So how do you define a buffer? Buffer is simply a chemical that minimizes a change in the pH. So whenever you have an acid, immediately the protons released from the acid will alter the pH, will increase acidity, and pH will lower. Well, every time we go through aerobic respiration, we're generating CO2, and we already established that CO2 is an acid. So every time you do aerobic respiration and generate CO2, you're forming an acid. Well, in that case, pH is going to start dropping. And then when you excrete out CO2, pH will start increasing. So what's going to happen is that there's going to be a big yo-yo or sine wave in terms of pH. So pH is just going to go up and down as you produce CO2 and excrete CO2, and again produce CO2 and excrete CO2. Similarly, when you generate sulfuric acid from catabolism of proteins, again pH is going to plummet, and then when you get rid of it, for example, then pH is going to rise. Well, there are too many swings in the pH. That's not good. We have to maintain pH within the 7.35 to 7.45 range, so that's why we start using buffers. So buffers will help to minimize the change in the pH. So if you add a weak acid, then it's not going to become too acidic as well. So you can't buffer very strong acids, but you can buffer weak acids over there. So even though you produce a weak acid, the pH is not going to change very much because you have buffers in blood over there. So buffers will work immediately. So there's really a couple of buffer systems in the body. In blood, the most important buffer system is the bicarbonate buffer system. So it's the most important buffer system in the ECF, or extracellular fluid, of which plasma is one of the main components besides interstitial fluid. So how do we generate the bicarbonate? Well, it's really straightforward. Bicarbonate is generated from CO2. We saw that previously. That's how you transport CO2 in blood. It's by forming bicarbonate. So it's CO2 plus H2O will form carbonic acid in the presence of carbonic anhydrase. That's the enzyme found in red blood cells. And then carbonic acid, H2CO3, will dissociate to form H plus and bicarbonate over there. So that's how we form the bicarbonate from carbonic acid. And how do we form carbonic acid? From CO2. So really, in order for the buffer system to work, or the bicarbonate buffer system to work, the ratio of the bicarbonate to carbonic acid has to be 20:1. We'll see that really comes down to the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, which is on the separate videos that are posted on Blackboard. So make sure that you look at the two other videos that are posted on Blackboard as well, besides this narrated PowerPoint slideshow. So the other thing that we have to talk about is, how do we get rid of CO2? Because CO2, we've established, is an acid, right? Previously, we saw the buffer system that acts almost immediately to buffer all the other acids in our body. And those buffers really operate almost instantaneously. And now we'll talk about how do we get rid of the carbonic acid that's produced from CO2. So that's why CO2 is an acid, because it produces carbonic acid when it reacts with water, as you can see over here. Typically, you need the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, but regardless, you still will form carbonic acid. So only the respiratory system can adjust for the levels of carbonic acid, right? Because carbonic acid is a volatile acid, because it can be excreted when you do the reverse reaction. You can convert it back to CO2, and you can excrete out CO2 and water as well. So the rate and depth of respiration is really what determines the amount of carbonic acid, and really what determines the amount of CO2 that is retained in the body. If we produced, and we all know this, if we produce more CO2 than normal, for example during exercise, our respiratory rate, our ventilation, will increase in order to excrete out the excess CO2. So that's really what it comes down to. The respiratory system adjusts the amount of CO2 in our body, and CO2 is important because it's an acid. It eventually will form carbonic acid over there. So here's the question: if too much carbonic acid is produced, what's going to happen to the respiratory rate and depth? if you said that the respiratory rate is going to increase, hyperventilation, then you're right, because we need to get rid of the extra carbonic acid. So really what we're doing is excreting out the extra CO2. Similarly, if you have less than normal amounts of CO2 and hence less than normal amounts of carbonic acid, the respiratory rate will decrease, hypoventilation, in order to retain more CO2. Remember, we need to have just the right amount of CO2 because CO2 is what ultimately determines our respiratory rate. The body doesn't take into account oxygen until PO2 levels drop below 60. It's CO2 that determines our respiratory rate. Why? Very simply, because CO2 is an acid. Too much CO2 is bad, too little CO2 is also bad. It has to be in just the right range, 36 to 44 millimeters of mercury. That's PaCO2, so partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial blood gas system. So we do an arterial blood gas to get that value. Let's look at this table now to understand what exactly is happening. So when PaCO2, or the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial gas, you get that from an arterial blood gas sample, or ABG value. When it starts increasing, we know that because CO2 is an acid, acidity is going to increase, pH is going to decrease. In a healthy individual, what is going to happen next is that you're going to start increasing your ventilatory rate. You're going to have hyperventilation. Hyperventilation will occur in order to excrete out more CO2, and thus pH will start rising. In that case, what we've done is corrected for that imbalance. In other words, the excess CO2 is excreted out. So in a normal individual, again, for example, when we're exercising, we're going to be producing more CO2 than normal. pH is going to start dropping, but we're going to start hyperventilating to excrete out more the CO2, and hence pH is going to come back into the normal range. pH is going to increase as we excrete out more CO2. So that's why we need, our breathing rate is going to increase dramatically. We're going to hyperventilate. That's a corrected imbalance. That's something that we can do to correct that imbalance immediately, because there's nothing wrong with the lungs. We're healthy individuals. We can correct that imbalance immediately. Similarly, if for whatever reason our CO2 levels drop below normal, we have less acid. CO2 is an acid, remember, we have less of this acid than normal. Well, pH is going to start increasing. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to retain more CO2. So we do that by hypoventilation. And thus we've corrected the imbalance. More CO2 is retained. On the other hand, when we'll get to this, in metabolic acidosis, that really means that we have an excess of all the other acids, all the other metabolic acids as they're called. And yes, pH is going to start decreasing. And then in this case over here, because the respiratory system is going to try to help out, we have more of the other acids. Say this is lactic acidosis, decrease in blood supply, low tissue perfusion, whatever the case might be, we develop lactic acidosis, which is a form of metabolic acidosis. So we have more of the other part of acids in our body. So now there's nothing we can do about the lactic acidosis at this stage. Maybe you want to try to correct for the low tissue perfusion, but immediately at least there's nothing you can do in terms of adjusting the lactic acid levels. So what can we do? Well, in order to achieve homeostasis, again, we need to compensate for that. How do we compensate for that? Well, really, there's only two parts of acid, right? We have two parts of acids. Maybe we can draw this out. Let me see if I can find my pen over here. Here we go. So let's see if I can draw this out. Okay, let's use red. So, and this is also shown on all the other videos. You want to think of it as a seesaw. And there are two parts of acid. On one side, we have CO2, and on the other side, we have all the other acids in our body. Well, in the case of metabolic acidosis, for example, lactic acidosis, we have too much of this other part, right? And there's nothing really much we can do about this immediately. But if we have too much of this other part of acid in our body, and really homeostasis is about a balance between these two parts of acid, all we can do is try to reduce this. Wouldn't that make sense? CO2 is also an acid, it's a volatile acid, and we can adjust this because although we have lactic acidosis, at this stage at least there's nothing wrong with our lungs. So the respiratory system will say, hey, I can help out. I can help out by getting rid of more CO2. How do we get rid of more CO2? By hyperventilation. So in hyperventilation, that's the compensated response. So the compensation for metabolic acidosis is respiratory in nature, and it is hyperventilation. So as we hyperventilate during metabolic acidosis, we excrete out more CO2, and hopefully we get back into balance, because it's really all about the balance between CO2 and all the other acids, right? So only the respiratory system can excrete CO2, not the other systems in our body. So we say now that it is a compensated imbalance. The pH might come back actually into the normal range. Initially, the pH will drop, but now because we hyperventilate and get rid of more CO2, the pH can go back into the normal region, and we say that's compensated. It's not corrected. Corrected means it's something that the original system can correct for. So here, when we get rid of too much CO2, when we have too much CO2, well, the respiratory system can correct it. So remember, it's a respiratory system that adjusts CO2 levels, so we can correct it. But if there's something wrong with the respiratory system, then we can't correct it, right? So we can only compensate for it with the metabolic system, as we'll see. So correction is the same system correcting for it. So if CO2 levels have changed, well, if the lungs respond, then it's a corrected response. On the other hand, in metabolic acidosis, you can't adjust the other system, so it's only the respiratory system that can respond. So that's compensation, because we're not adjusting the original imbalance, the imbalance being, say, too much lactic acid. We're trying to compensate for it. So hopefully you know the difference between compensation and correction, and we'll go through this again because it's so important and students often get mixed up between the two. In metabolic alkalosis, what's happened is that, again, we'll draw the little seesaw over here. We have too little of the other acids, right? That's why we have too little of the other acids, and there's a deficit of metabolic acids, and pH is going to start rising because we have too little of the other acid. So how can we correct it? Well, we can correct it. So in this case over here, for example, during prolonged vomiting, we're losing all the HCl in our stomach. Well, you can't correct for it immediately. What can you do? How can you just suddenly produce HCl on a dime? You can't do it. So all we can do is to try to compensate for it. So as the hydrochloric acid decreases and total amount of the metabolic acid decreases, well, the body will say, hey, or at least the respiratory system will say, let me try to help out. Let's try to increase the amount of CO2, because CO2 is an acid too, right? If you lost all the other acids, maybe we can try to compensate with having more CO2. Let's try to retain more CO2. How do you retain more CO2? By hypoventilation. So that's the compensation. The respiratory compensation for metabolic alkalosis is hypoventilation in order to retain more CO2. Hopefully that's a little bit clear. Lastly, the third system that we have in the acid-base homeostasis is the renal or urinary system. Renal, kidney, urinary, all kind of synonyms of each other. So this system, remember, buffers work immediately. The respiratory system can work in minutes, at least, or 2 hours. And the renal system, however, needs at least 24 hours up to 5 days. So it's slow to act and it can take several days to achieve homeostasis again. So in the kidneys, we can excrete out really anything, including acids. The only thing that you can't excrete out in terms of acid is carbonic acid, because carbonic acid is a volatile acid. That's the job of the lungs. The lungs will adjust the level of carbonic acid by excreting out CO2. So, but all the other metabolic acids, sulfuric acid, lactic acid, hydrochloric acid, phosphoric acid, keto acids, all those other acids can be excreted out by the kidneys. So the kidneys will, if there are more than normal amounts of metabolic acids being synthesized, being produced, then the kidneys will increase the amount of excretion of that acid. If there's a deficit of these metabolic acids, the kidneys will decrease the excretion of that acid. So remember, the kidneys do all that, but the caveat here is that the kidney functioning has to be normal. You can have chronic renal failure or end-stage renal disease. That's not going to work. Hence, this whole system will essentially be non-functional. So, but otherwise, in a healthy individual whose kidneys are functioning normally, the kidneys can help to excrete out metabolic acids, not CO2, the metabolic acids. So that's acid-base homeostasis in a nutshell. Over there, just a little bit more detailed about how this occurs. Not that it's really very important, but the kidneys work by, in the nephrons, secreting the hydrogen ions. But for every hydrogen ion that's secreted, in order to balance the charge, bicarbonate ion has to be reabsorbed. So all this is really better explained when we look at the diagram on the next slide. And this ammonium, and as we'll see also phosphate, those are what we call urinary buffers. So the main buffer in blood, remember, is bicarbonate, but we also have other buffers in urine, because as we excrete out all the metabolic acids, we also have to buffer the urine as well, because otherwise urine will become too acidic. That's also not good. So ammonia and phosphate are also buffers that are used to buffer out all the metabolic acids that are excreted out or secreted out in the nephron. So here's really how it works. Firstly, we'll start off over here. Again, this is probably not that important, but just to show you. Remember, in the glomerulus, everything is filtered, including bicarbonate, of which we have plenty. And remember, CO2 is transported as bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is the main extracellular buffer. So bicarbonate is also filtered. And yes, we need to reabsorb the bicarbonate, otherwise pretty soon we'll have no bicarbonate left in blood. So bicarbonate is here. This is the lumen of the Nephron, these are the cells in, say, in the proximal convoluted tubule over here, and this is all the interstitial spaces. Eventually get reabsorbed in the peritubular capillary. So how do we reabsorb the bicarbonate? Well, for sodium, all the electrolytes, it's really easy. There's a separate ion channel for sodium, potassium, etc. But for bicarbonate, there's no separate ion channel. So we have to do a workaround. So there's no specific ion channel for bicarbonate. So hence we really can reabsorb bicarbonate directly. So how do we do that? How do we eventually reabsorb bicarbonate? Well, here's the trick. You take bicarbonate, add an acid, convert it to carbonic acid, convert carbonic acid to CO2. That's the exact opposite of the reaction that we saw where CO2 we proved is an acid. So CO2 is transported really in that in the form of bicarbonate by converting CO2 with water to carbonic acid and then dissociated bicarbonate. Here we're just doing the reverse reaction. So take the bicarbonate, as long as the acid is present, convert it to carbonic acid, and carbonic acid will dissociate to CO2. We reabsorb the CO2 into the cells of the proximal convoluted tubule, and then we use carbonic anhydrase to convert it to carbonic acid, and then dissociate the carbonic acid into the acid and the bicarbonate. The bicarbonate we reabsorb, the acid we secrete into the lumen to react it with the bicarbonate that was filtered. So if you do the accounting, you will see everything cancels out. The bicarbonate over here eventually goes here, everything else cancels out. Here's a H2CO3 on this side, that cancels out this side, here's water CO2, here's water CO2, everything cancels out over there. And even the proton comes from here, that also eventually cancels out, as we will see. So the net result is that's how we reabsorb bicarbonate, by converting it to CO2, reabsorbing the CO2, and then converting it back to bicarbonate and reabsorbing it, right? So that's carbon, that goes here, and eventually everything else is recycled. So this is the reabsorption of bicarbonate. Sometimes, however, we need to, where do we have this? Here. Sometimes, however, we need to reabsorb new bicarbonate. We'll see the case why that might be. So yes, most of the bicarbonate that is filtered is reabsorbed, but sometimes we need to absorb new bicarbonate over there. So that new bicarbonate tells you that was not filtered, but we need to reabsorb it. We'll see why in a second. It really has to do with the compensation for respiratory acidosis and alkalosis. So sometimes we need to, especially for respiratory acidosis, sometimes we need to reabsorb new bicarbonate. That's shown over here. So how do we form new bicarbonate? Well, like always, we start off with CO2. That's the only way we can form bicarbonate. So with plenty of CO2 in the body, so CO2 reacts with carbonic anhydrase, forms H2CO3. By the way, carbonic anhydrase is present in the cells of the proximal convoluted tubule. So carbonic anhydrase converts CO2 and water to carbonic acid. The carbonic acid dissociates to acid and bicarbonate. The new bicarbonate is reabsorbed. The acid is secreted and buffered by the urinary buffers. Here's phosphate. So showing you that the phosphate buffers the acid so that we don't decrease urinary pH too far, right? So that's a new bicarbonate that wasn't there before. That's a new bicarbonate that we reabsorbed over there. Similarly, if we have another buffer that we see over here is ammonia. So we'll take ammonia, and this is similarly absorption of new bicarbonate. So CO2 water, carbonic anhydrase forms carbonic acid, reabsorb, dissociates into carbonate, reabsorb that, the new bicarbonate, and then the acid is secreted out and buffered by ammonia to form the ammonium ion. How do we get ammonia? From glutathione, for example, over here. So basically it comes from amino acids over there. So we convert that to ammonia, secrete out the ammonia, and then that's the buffer for the acid that is produced from CO2 in order to absorb the new bicarbonate. So here's recycling of bicarbonate. How do we reabsorb filtered bicarbonate? All this is how do we reabsorb, how do we absorb new bicarbonate? How do we increase the bicarbonate levels, serum bicarbonate levels? So again, I don't think it's very important, but hey, we've gone through it. Okay, so in metabolic acidosis, over there, let's talk about renal responses, and then we'll, again, how do we diagnose what's happening and what the compensation is? Please watch the other two videos that are posted on Blackboard. Firstly, you need to diagnose it based upon the three criteria of pH, PaCO2, and bicarbonate levels. So anyways, let's say we have metabolic acidosis. So that means that we have too much of all the other acids in our body, say lactic acidosis, hence pH will start dropping. That's not good, right? So what is the renal response? So if you have lactic acidosis, for example, well, the kidneys can start secreting out all the acids. The kidneys can also reabsorb more bicarbonate. Why do you want to reabsorb more bicarbonate? To buffer the acid, right? Remember, bicarbonate is a buffer. And then you also make more ammonia to also buffer the plus that's secreted into the tubules in urine eventually. So that's a renal response. So in metabolic acidosis, if you suddenly have to switch to anaerobic respiration, say you're running a marathon, you have, or even the 400 meters, you're going to use quite a bit of anaerobic respiration. Lactic acid is going to build up. Well, this is the renal response. But this is correction, because we started off with too much of the metabolic acids, and now we're trying to get rid of all the metabolic acid. That's just a correction. The kidneys will excrete out the excess metabolic acids. Similarly, if you have a deficit of metabolic acids, well, we decrease acid secretion, we decrease reabsorption. Why do we decrease bicarbonate reabsorption? That's because we have less of the other acids in a body. Wait, we don't need to buffer so much, otherwise you're going to get less and less acid. So we decrease the bicarbonate reabsorption, so we have less bicarbonate to less buffer to buffer, less bicarbonate to buffer the other acids, and hopefully the other acids will increase in nature. That's again a correction. But on the other hand, if you have respiratory acidosis, that means we have too much CO2. pH starts dropping. What can we do? In respiratory acidosis, well, we assume that in this case, the lungs cannot correct it. The lungs cannot just simply hyperventilate to get rid of more CO2, because COPD, for example, that was one of the etiologies of respiratory acidosis. In COPD, you can't just command the lungs to increase the respiration rate. That's the whole problem to begin with. COPD causes hypoventilation. So CO2 builds up, respiratory acidosis has occurred, pH starts dropping. What can the kidneys do to compensate? Remember, there are really only two systems, the respiratory system and, well, we have buffer, but that's also, bicarbonate is really part of the renal system, as we'll see. What can we do? Only the renal system of the kidneys can compensate. How can they compensate? By excreting out more acids of all the other acids. Why? Again, we come down to the same little two pots of acid analogy. We have the seesaw, not a very straight seesaw, but anyways, I can't even draw a straight line, as everyone knows. On one side we have CO2. Too much CO2, problem with the lungs. We can't correct it, we can only compensate for it. How do we compensate for it? By all the other acids. Well, yes, we need to decrease all the other acids. How do we decrease the other acids? Secrete out acids and excrete it in the urine by the kidneys, and yes, buffer more acids. How do we buffer more acids? By getting more buffer. What's the main extracellular buffer? Bicarbonate. So if we increase bicarbonate reabsorption, now we have more buffer. We can buffer all the other acids, decrease the total amount of other metabolic acids, and then we can compensate for it. So the renal compensation for respiratory acidosis is mainly increase bicarbonate reabsorption. Similarly, in respiratory alkalosis, let's try to make the seesaw a little bit better. In respiratory alkalosis, two parts CO2, too little CO2 for whatever reason. This is hypoventilation. Well, what can cause hypoventilation? Well, there's several causes. One of them could be a drug overdose, not opioid. That will cause hypoventilation. A salicylate overdose will cause hyperventilation. Now we're getting rid of too much CO2, right? And so CO2 levels will decrease. So in medication toxicity, salicylate poisoning overdoses can cause hyperventilation. We all know opioid overdoses causes hypoventilation. Eventually, the entire respiratory system shuts down. The respiratory rate goes to zero. So in that case, one cause of respiratory acidosis could be, yes, opioid overdose. One etiology of respiratory alkalosis could be salicylate overdose, salicylic acid, aspirin. Okay, so in another case, whatever the case might be, and we'll look at other etiologies as well, you have less than normal amounts of CO2. So pH starts increasing because CO2 is an acid. We don't have enough CO2. pH starts increasing, respiratory alkalosis. Well, nothing we can do if you have salicylate poisoning, short of, well, you try to correct it by pumping, say, activated. Oh, sorry, that's my daughter screaming in the background. But those of you with kids know the drill very well. We'll push ahead. You have in salicylate poisoning, short of pumping activated charcoal in the stomach, not much you can do. So hyperventilation would still occur, CO2 levels would decrease below normal. What's the compensation? Can't correct it, but we can compensate for it by increasing all the other acids in our body. How do we increase the other acids in the body? Buffer it less. How do we buffer it less? Have less buffer. How do we get less buffer? Decrease bicarbonate reabsorption. So the renal compensation for respiratory alkalosis is to decrease bicarbonate reabsorption. Serum bicarbonate levels will decrease, right? Less buffer, more of the other acids. Hopefully we come back into homeostasis, we can compensate for it. Similarly, when we increase bicarbonate reabsorption, we're talking about increasing serum bicarbonate levels over there, right? So that's compensation, again, not correction. So the renal compensation occurs during respiratory acidosis or alkalosis. The respiratory compensation occurs during metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. We saw that on the previous slide. Let's move ahead. The kids are still screaming over there. So again, correction versus compensation. So remember, the lungs can only correct carbonic acids, not metabolic acids. So when the lungs alter carbonic acids or CO2 levels, really, so let's write here CO2 levels, the imbalance is being corrected. So it's when the lungs adjust the CO2 levels, whatever imbalance was there, that's going to be just corrected of CO2, right? So when you exercise, you have more CO2 than normal. Well, the lungs will correct it by hyperventilation, right? If you hold your breath for too long, CO2 levels also increase above normal. Well, the lungs will correct it by suddenly gasping for air and increasing the breathing rate. Again, hyperventilation. If you have lower than normal amounts of CO2 levels, then the lungs will correct for it, not compensate, correct for it by hypoventilation, retain more CO2. On the other hand, in metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, the lungs will compensate for the imbalance because it's, again, the two-part analogy. In metabolic acidosis, alkalosis, we have too much or too little of all the other acids in the body, right? If this has gone up, then CO2 needs to go down. So the respiratory system can try to compensate. That's compensation. When you adjust the other part, that's compensation. Maybe that's the easiest way to explain it. Over here, correction is, say CO2 levels have gone up or down, well, just correct it. If it's gone up, bring it down. If it's gone down, bring it up. The lungs can correct it. But if you can't correct it, then you can only compensate for it with the other part of acids, the metabolic acid. Hopefully that's clear. I think I've belabored this point too much, so you can go through this, but just make sure you understand the difference between correction and compensation. We'll talk more about compensation when we look at the actual acid-base imbalances. Okay, let's talk about the real acid-base imbalances over here. So in acidosis, what's the definition of acidosis? pH is below normal. That's the definition of acidosis. pH has to drop below normal. Below what? Let's make sure that we write down all the normal values. So normal ranges. Normal range of pH, 7.35 to 7.45. If it's below, if pH is less than 7 point, now we have to work off a range. As we'll see, we have to work off not a range of a single number. If pH is less than 7.4, we say it's acidosis. If pH is greater than 7.4, we say it's alkalosis. Because eventually we have to solve these problems. You're given three values. We are given the pH, and then let's do this over here. We are given PaCO2 levels. PaCO2 levels is 36 to 44 millimeters of mercury. Now again, we have to work off a range. So we work off one number, 40 millimeters of mercury. So if PaCO2 levels are high, we say it's greater than 40. If PaCO2 levels are low, we say it's less than 40. And now again, yes, 38 is normal range, but we have to, when solving these problems, we have to work off a single number. Similarly, for bicarbonate levels, it's 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter, but we work off a single value, and that is 24 milliequivalents per liter. If it's less than that, it's below normal. If it's greater than that, we say it's above normal. Again, work off a single number. So firstly, how do we solve this? Is it respiratory acidosis? Given these three values, is it respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis? How do we know? Well, we start off with the pH. And please, really, we use an algorithm. So again, refer you to the other two videos on Blackboard. It's YouTube videos where I show you how to solve these problems in terms of, given these three values, how do we identify, is it respiratory acidosis, alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, alkalosis? First thing, you start off with pH. pH less than 7.4, acidosis. pH greater than 7.4, alkalosis. Next step, is it respiratory or metabolic in nature? Which of the two parts has been affected? Well, here's where we use the ROME acronym. Respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. So we start off by looking at the pH. If the pH has gone down, respiratory opposite, it means that CO2 has to be up for it to be respiratory acidosis, right? PaCO2 and pH have to be moving in the opposite direction. Why? Because CO2 is an acid. As CO2 increases, acidity increases, pH decreases. So in respiratory acidosis, PaCO2 levels are increasing, pH is decreasing. Similarly, in alkalosis, pH is increasing. For respiratory alkalosis, PaCO2 is decreasing. We have less than normal amounts of CO2. That's why less than normal amounts of acid. That's why pH is increasing. For metabolic acidosis, again, how do we know it's acidosis? pH less than 7.4. For metabolic acidosis, it means that we have less than the other, we have more of the other acids. So let's draw this again. Over here, this little part. We have more of the other acids. How do we know that we have more of the other acids, like lactic acid, keto acids, phosphoric acid, sulfuric acid, whatever the case might be? Well, it's really difficult to directly measure all the other acids in the body. So what we use is a surrogate. We use bicarbonate. We use a buffer. Because if we have the normal amounts of the metabolic acids in our body, well, bicarbonate will be in the normal range. If we have more of this, like in metabolic acidosis, well, now we need to buffer all this out. So what will happen is that bicarbonate levels will start dropping. Doesn't that make sense? Because bicarbonate is a buffer. We have more of all the other metabolic acids. We're going to use more of the buffer to buffer it out. And hence bicarbonate levels will start decreasing. So we use the bicarbonate levels as a surrogate to see how much of all the other acids we have in our body. So alterations in the bicarbonate levels are metabolic in nature because bicarbonate doesn't affect the CO2. In fact, we get bicarbonate from CO2. You can't buffer, bicarbonate can't buffer CO2 because it's made from CO2. It's just not happening. Bicarbonate buffers all the other metabolic acids. So in metabolic acidosis, pH is decreasing. It's less than 7.4. And really, it is because bicarbonate levels are decreasing. That's because we have too much of all the other metabolic acids. So we're using up all our buffers, or at least a lot of our buffers, and serum bicarbonate levels are decreasing. That's the metabolic equal part for Rome over here. ME, metabolic equal, right? So the equal part means is pH is going down for metabolic acidosis. Bicarbonate levels are going down. Why is it going down? Because we're buffering out all the other metabolic acids. Similarly, for metabolic alkalosis, pH levels are increasing above normal. Why? Because we have a deficit of the metabolic acids in our body. So because we have a deficit of the metabolic acids in our body, our bicarbonate is not needed as much. We don't need as much buffer in the body. Serum bicarbonate levels start increasing over here. That's the equal part working in the same direction, right? So it's useful to use this Rome acronym to try to figure it out, whether once you've established acidosis or alkalosis, is it respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, or is it metabolic acidosis or alkalosis? We do that by just simply using this acronym over here. All right, let's just briefly talk about compensation. So going back to respiratory acidosis, pH dropping, CO2 levels increasing, the opposite part. What's going to happen? Well, we can't correct for it because there's something wrong with the lungs to begin with. So we can only compensate for it. So for example, in COPD, this is a good example of COPD is a good etiology for respiratory acidosis. So PaCO2 levels increase because we are hypoventilating. So in a COPD client or patient, hypoventilation is the problem. Hence, CO2 is retained, pH starts dropping. What can you do? Well, nothing the lungs can do because it has COPD. So the only thing that can do is renal compensation. What's the renal compensation? So here we go back to our little arrow over here. Too much CO2, that's a problem because of COPD, a lifetime of smoking, for example. So what can we do? And we'll talk about COPD in Unit 7 when we do the respiratory disorders. What can we do? The only thing we can do is to adjust the other part of acids, the metabolic acids over there. So since we have too much of CO2 and CO2 is an acid, wouldn't it make sense to decrease the amount of metabolic acids? How do we decrease the amount of metabolic acids? Buffer it more. Hence, don't you think we need more bicarbonate? Yeah. If you have more buffer, we can buffer it more. So serum bicarbonate levels should increase above normal. That's the compensation. Renal compensation is to increase serum bicarbonate levels because the kidneys are secreting more metabolic acids, right? That's really why it occurs, and the easier way to think of it is it's going to act as a buffer, right? So I don't want to go into this, otherwise I'll just start confusing. It has to do with the previous slide where we saw when you secrete a nephron, you reabsorb a new bicarbonate. So that's why bicarbonate levels will increase. So you want to think of it that way, or you want to think of it as having more buffer. Either way works. Similarly, if you go into the other side, if you have too little CO2, right? Here we have CO2 over here. So in the case of having too little CO2, that's also a problem, right? That's respiratory alkalosis. So we have too little CO2. What can cause too little CO2? Here we have CO2. CO2 levels have decreased. Well, that's a problem. What causes CO2 levels to decrease below normal? Well, it's because of hyperventilation, right? When you hyperventilate, that's a primary disorder. You're going to excrete out more CO2. CO2 levels are going to decrease. CO2 is an acid. As this part of acid decreases, pH is going to increase, right? pH is automatically going to increase over there. What can cause hyperventilation? Oh, a whole variety of causes. Anxiety, as we'll see when we do the respiratory disorders. Pulmonary embolism is a pretty good example of that. PE or pneumonia, your respiratory rate increases over there. Asthma, sepsis, even hypoxia, that can cause an increased rate, right? You're starving for oxygen, so your respiratory rate increases. Others could be due to, we mentioned this previously, salicylate toxicity. So salicylate poisoning can cause hyperventilation as well. So we'll look at the various etiologies of respiratory alkalosis. So anyways, we have too little CO2. pH is rising. Can compensate for that, can correct for that. See, it's very easy to mix up the terms, but can correct for that. The only way we can correct for that is by telling the lungs to stop hyperventilating. Well, we can't do that. That's the problem to begin with, right? If you have pulmonary embolism, you can't suddenly stop hyperventilating. So the only thing we can do is to compensate. How do we compensate? Compensate with the other part of metabolic acid. Since we have too little of the other CO2, well, maybe it makes sense to have more metabolic acids. So the renal compensation is to have more metabolic acids, decrease secretion of the acids, hence, and the other way to think about it is to buffer it less. How do we buffer it less? By having less bicarbonate. Serum bicarbonate levels should decrease. Less buffering, metabolic acids increase to help to compensate for a decrease in CO2. So that's really what it goes. So the kidneys will secrete out more bicarbonate, and that's because the kidneys will, you need the bicarbonate to buffer the acids over there. So that's what's going to happen over there. So you have too little CO2, you want a less buffer over there, and you excrete out more CO2, hence metabolic acids increase, and that will help to achieve homeostasis, right? We did this already, right? Metabolic acidosis, too much of the other acids, what can we do? That's because we're buffering, or maybe we haven't. So what's a compensation? Well, kind of just this. That would be correction. How do we compensate? Well, too much metabolic acid. Well, let's try to have less CO2. How do we do? So what's a compensation? Respiratory compensation is to reduce PaCO2 level by hyperventilation. Again, classic example of this would be in someone with type 1 diabetes mellitus who hasn't taken the insulin. Now they'll start breaking down fats, for example. You'll end up with the ketone bodies. Those are keto acids. All the metabolic acids are increased. Now that the other big part has increased, pH has started to decrease over there. In that case, what can happen is that we need to decrease. The compensation means the body says, hey, we already have too much keto acids over there. Let's try to get rid of some CO2 so that we can achieve homeostasis to get pH back in the normal range. That's the whole point of compensation, remember, to get pH back in the normal range. So let's get rid of more CO2. How do we do that? Hyperventilation. So as I was saying, in the type 1 diabetic who's forgotten, say, to take their insulin and now have ketoacidosis, you will see the characteristic response is to have deep rhythmic rapid breathing, which is called Kussmaul breathing. So in Kussmaul breathing, it's hyperventilation, but it's typically rather deep as well, and that will help to get rid of more CO2. It's hyperventilation over there. So that occurs in severe metabolic acidosis, especially when pH drops below 7.2. That's the deep rhythmic breathing called Kussmaul respiration. So you should be on the lookout for that if you suspect severe metabolic acidosis, and that will give you a clue that it's probably also ketoacidosis. What about in metabolic alkalosis? Here again, the little seesaw, too little of the other acids. What can cause that? Say vomiting. Right? So prolonged vomiting can cause a release of all the HCl in the stomach, and that can cause a deficit of metabolic acid. So now metabolic acids have decreased over there. What can the body do? Can't correct for it. How do you produce HCl on a dime? Can't do that. So the body will say, okay, we have a deficit of metabolic acid. Let's have more CO2. Let's retain more CO2. So the respiratory compensation would be hypoventilation in metabolic alkalosis over there, right? So we have a deficit of metabolic acid, and that's because hence we don't need to buffer so much acid, and that's the serum bicarbonate levels increase. That's a primary imbalance. So let's actually write all these primary imbalances over there. That's the primary imbalance. That's the primary imbalance over here. And primary imbalance. Okay, So in respiratory alkalosis, the primary imbalance is deficit of metabolic acid, hence serum bicarbonate levels increase. Can't do much about it. Compensation, respiratory compensation. You can't tell the kidneys to adjust it because that's the primary imbalance to begin with. So the only compensation, it has to be respiratory in nature. We want to retain more CO2, hypoventilation. Hopefully that's a little bit clear. Again, there's 2 separate videos where I write kind of all this out and explain it again, the concepts. That's one video. I'm probably labeled it as the handwritten notes, and where I'm writing things down and explaining those notes to you. And the other one is a whole separate video on how do we solve these acid-base imbalances. So given pH, PaCO2, and bicarbonate, how do you know whether it's respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, or metabolic alkalosis? Well, we do that by using the algorithm. So please watch that other video over there. There are 4 problems that we go through to help you do activity 2. So before you do activity 2, make sure you go through those 4 problems as well. Okay, we can move on. So you're talking about the interpretation of acid-base imbalances, as I was on the previous slide. Here's what your book does. Your book starts off by looking at PaCO2. Now, I don't think that makes any sense, because after all, the first thing that we have to do is to identify, is it an acidosis or alkalosis? So we need to start off with pH. I think the only reason why your book does it this way is to be different. Sometimes it's not good to just stand out for no particular reason. So I think my approach is better, honestly, and it's an approach used by everything else. It's not my approach, it's a standard approach. Standard approach is, you know what, why don't we just do it over here? The standard approach is start with pH. So pH less than 7.4, what is it? Acidosis. It has to be acidosis. Remember, we work off a single value, not the ranges. The ranges are 7.35 to 7.45. The reason why we don't work off the ranges is because the pH, if it's 7.38, we'll say, oh, it's normal, and then forget about it. Well, no, it could be normal because it could be compensated. How do you know? The only way you'll know is to go through the whole algorithm. So the pH is less than 7.4 is acidosis. pH is greater than 7.4, it's alkalosis. Next, what do we use? The Rome acronym. So pH is going down in one direction. If it's respiratory acidosis, which way does pH, remember, if it's respiratory, it's all about CO2. If it's respiratory acidosis, which way does CO2 levels have to do? PaCO2 levels are moving in the opposite direction. Why? Because CO2 is an acid. So greater than 40 millimeters of mercury, that's 40. Then it's respiratory acidosis. Respiratory opposite, pH going down, PaCO2 going up. If it's metabolic acidosis, serum bicarbonate levels, too little of the other part of acids, too much of the other part of acids, so serum bicarbonate levels, we've used a lot of the buffer to buffer these acids, has to be decreased below 24 milliequivalents per liter. Right? Metabolic equal, pH going down, bicarbonate levels going down. We know it's metabolic acid. Since I'm going to run out of space over here, I'm going to do it this way. It doesn't look as neat. It should really be all in the same line. Anyways, if it's alkalosis, it's because pH is greater than 7.4. How do we know if it's respiratory alkalosis? I should have moved this silly diagram off to one side and I would have more space. But whatever, let's go. So pH greater than 7.4, hence alkalosis, right? How do we know it's respiratory alkalosis? Go to use a Rome acronym. Respiratory opposite. pH going up, well, PaCO2 has to be going down. Well, that makes sense. We have less than normal amounts of CO2, which is an acid, so pH is increasing. That's a respiratory alkalosis. What about metabolic alkalosis? For metabolic alkalosis, we know that we have less than normal amounts of all the other acids in our body. That means we don't need as much buffers, so the bicarbonate levels, I'm running out of space over here, have to be greater than 24 milliequivalents per liter. Run out of space, oops. Okay, I can't write the units. Anyways, so, okay, maybe we'll write it over here on this. What am I doing? Oops, jumped ahead too far. There we go. Sorry about that. So for metabolic acidosis, serum bicarbonate levels where we less than 24 milliequivalents per liter. Every time I touch the edge, it goes forward. Okay, so metabolic equal, pH going up. Oh, see, I made a mistake over here. Not good, not good, not good. That's why
greater than 24. Here is less than. How can it be the same? The reason being, I didn't get confused, but I'm just distracted by the slides keep on moving. So the reason being, let's start again, greater than 7.4 alkalosis. How do we know it's metabolic alkalosis? Well, we have a deficit of metabolic acids. Hence, we don't need as much buffer. I think I said that. We don't need as much bicarbonate in the blood. Bicarbonate levels increase at greater than 24 milliequivalents per liter. All right, and that's the way we know it's metabolic alkalosis. We can take this chart one step further and see what the compensation is. For respiratory acidosis, it's renal compensation. What's the renal compensation? Well, too little, and I've drawn this a million times before already, maybe not a million. Use a little seesaw diagram, and you can figure this out. For respiratory acidosis, too much CO2, well, the only way you can compensate is by decreasing this. How do we decrease that? By increasing this. Right? We need to bring all the metabolic acids down, well, buffer it more. We need more bicarbonate. Renal compensation is to increase bicarbonate reabsorption, increase serum bicarbonate levels by increasing the reabsorption. I'm going to run out of space over here. So anyway, you can write this out for yourself if you're following along. And yes, I've do this again on the 2 other videos as well, so no shortage. In metabolic acidosis, we have too much of this acid. What can we do? Well, we can adjust this. We already have too much of that, so all we can do is bring this down. So for metabolic acidosis, the compensation is How do we get rid of more CO2? Hyperventilation. So the respiratory compensation for metabolic acidosis is hyperventilation, right? We mentioned that cow smell breathing. In, say, ketoacidosis, you have that deep rhythmic breathing, cow smell breathing, that's hyperventilation. Get rid of more CO2, CO2 levels come down. For respiratory alkalosis, so that's, I'm going to use abbreviations. You know what? I really shouldn't. So respiratory acidosis, this was metabolic acidosis. Wait, this is the hyperventilation. And here's the compensation over there. This is the kidneys. This is the respiratory compensation. Okay, I don't know if you can make sense of it. Anyways, let's go back over here. What would be respiratory alkalosis? So too little CO2 levels go down over there, and the only way we can compensate, not the lungs, say this could be, for example, in the whole problem is hyperventilation, like salicylate overdose or anxiety or pulmonary embolism, whatever the case might be. We're getting rid of too much CO2, can't adjust that, can't correct for it, but we can compensate by having more of the other acids. How do we have more of the other acids? By renal compensation. So let's write it down. So renal compensation is what? We want more of the other acids. Well, let's bring down the buffer. Bring down serum bicarbonate levels. Renal compensation is to bring down bicarbonate, right? So we can't directly measure that. So remember, this is the surrogate for that. So whenever you need to adjust metabolic acids, you adjust the bicarbonate levels. That's really what it comes down to. If you want more metabolic acids, well, you need less bicarbonate. If you want less bicarbonate, if you need less metabolic acids, you want more bicarbonate. So in metabolic alkalosis, lastly, so this is respiratory alkalosis. And lastly, in metabolic alkalosis, we have too little of the other metabolic acids. We have a deficit of metabolic acids. What are we going to do? Well, we can't suddenly produce more metabolic acids, but we can suddenly retain more CO2 very quickly, or at least within a few minutes to an hour. So what's the respiratory compensation? Respiratory compensation, how do we increase CO2 levels? Hypoventilation. So the respiratory compensation is hypoventilation. Why? In order to increase above normal, right? So that's the little algorithm that I'll use. If you want to use this, fine, but I think it's much easier to start off with the pH over there, because after all, the first thing we need to do is really to establish acidosis alkalosis. Now we get to the actual 4 acid-base imbalances in detail. We're going to look at it individually. Metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis, respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis. We're going to look at the etiology and pathogenesis. Really, etiology and pathogenesis are the same, because it's what causes it is really what develops the imbalance, as well as I'll explain. And then we'll look at the clinical manifestations as well. For metabolic acidosis, we have an excess of metabolic acids. So that could be by production, excessive production of that particular metabolic acid, lactic acid, keto acid, or it could be a decrease in the amount of base in a body. Typically, it's more acids being produced. So we'll stick with that. So typical etiologies include lactic acidosis, ketoacidosis, for example, during diabetes mellitus or prolonged starvation, and even in prolonged alcohol abuse can cause ketoacidosis. Lactic acidosis is caused by low tissue perfusion in many different states of shock, distributive or septic shock, cardiogenic or hypovolemic shock. We'll talk about shock when we do Unit 8 of various cardiovascular disorders. Even an excessive expenditure of energy can cause lactic acidosis. And now you will think, we're not talking about running marathons really, but we're talking about pathological states such as in seizures, where the overall metabolism increases dramatically, and hence lactic acidosis can result over that. One other thing that I want to point out is also the cause of diarrhea over here. So diarrhea can cause metabolic acidosis. How does diarrhea cause metabolic acidosis? Well, in diarrhea, you're losing bicarbonate because the intestinal juices are rich in bicarbonate. So when you have diarrhea, you're losing a lot of intestinal fluid, and which is very rich in bicarbonate. So you're losing all the bicarbonate, and hence serum bicarbonate levels will start decreasing. In fact, that's kind of the definition of acidosis, right? So remember, what we're talking about acidosis, firstly, pH has to be less than 7.4. And if it's metabolic in nature, it's all about bicarbonate level. So the definition of metabolic acidosis is when serum bicarbonate levels start decreasing. So it'll be less than 24 milliequivalents per liter. That's the ROME acronym, ROME. Here's the metabolic equal part over here. As pH starts decreasing, bicarbonate levels are also decreasing. In fact, the causal relationship runs the other way. As bicarbonate levels start decreasing, pH starts decreasing as well. Over there, right? So that's how diarrhea can lead to metabolic acidosis, when you lose all that bicarbonate in the intestinal juices. So that's one way. GI suction and drainage from the intestinal tract can also cause metabolic acidosis. We're not talking about suction from the stomach that can cause metabolic alkalosis, as we'll see. What about the clinical manifestations of metabolic acidosis? Well, the clinical manifestations we will see is really what I'm going to really add up over here, firstly, is hyperventilation. That's going to be the compensatory response, and that's what you're going to see over there. It's typically, as we've said this several times, that's the deep rhythmic breathing, also known as Kussmaul's respiration. So I'm going to write that down over here, Kussmaul's respiration, or Kussmaul's respiration. Classically, you see Kussmaul's respiration in severe metabolic acidosis. That's when pH less than 7.2 over there, right? That could be an example of a type 1 diabetic not taking their insulin. Then ketoacidosis will develop, which is a form of metabolic acidosis, and hyperventilation will also develop as a compensatory response over there, the deep rhythmic breathing. Other examples could be also, in the case of lactic acidosis, is that decrease cardiac output and tissue perfusion. So it's really a vicious cycle can develop. So in severe metabolic acidosis, due to lactic acidosis, the acidosis itself diminishes the tissue responsiveness to the catecholamines. What are the catecholamines? Epinephrine and norepinephrine. So what that really means is that the blood vessels are no longer as responsive to vasodilation and vasoconstriction over there, because the catecholamines causes vasoconstriction. This can lead to an undesirable chain of events. So essentially vasodilation occurs more in a more prolonged manner, resulting in hypotension, poor tissue perfusion, and that in turn will lead to exacerbate lactic acid production. So even more lactic acidosis results, and then that leads in turn into a further decrease in tissue perfusion. So all that's a very vicious cycle that starts in severe metabolic acidosis, and hence it needs to be treated as soon as possible. So other clinical manifestations that are a little bit more general include headache, abdominal pain, and CNS depression as well over there. So that's metabolic acidosis. For respiratory acidosis, it's all about having too much CO2, too much acid, right? Too much CO2 as an acid. So that's a definition of that. So really the etiology is any disorder that impairs gas exchange, or more generally speaking, any disorder that reduces CO2 excretion and thus inhibits adequate ventilation. So it could be a primary pulmonary disease such as COPD, or airway obstruction as in asthma or obstructive sleep apnea, or it could be a neuromuscular disease such as myasthenia gravis that prevents the diaphragm and the other respiratory muscles from working properly over there, or it could be CNS malfunctioning due to some damage to the brainstem, for example, or lastly, it could be due to drug-induced hypoventilation. So remember, in respiratory acidosis, it's all about hypoventilation. So drugs like the opioids can cause hypoventilation, right? And there's a missing I over here, so let's put the I, oops, I'm trying to write on the screen. This is not a touch screen, so I'll have to write on my little tablet over here. So I do know how to spell opioids, but I need to check my work a little bit more. Okay, so in opioid overdoses, hypoventilation results. In fact, breathing can completely cease, and that's the most common cause of death over there. So what's the renal compensation for respiratory acidosis? Renal compensation begins within 12 to 24 hours, but can take 5 days or so to finish over there, or to fully compensate over there. So what's the renal compensation for respiratory acidosis? Well, we want to decrease the rest of the part of metabolic acids, and we do that by buffering it out. So we need to increase bicarbonate absorption over there. So actually, just to start right from the beginning, it's respiratory acidosis because pH is less than 7.4, and it's respiratory, so it's all about CO2, right? So PaCO2. How do we know what PaCO2 is doing? We use the ROME acronym, or you can reason it out. Respiratory opposite. So if pH is decreasing, PaCO2 is increasing. Above, we stick to one value, 40 millimeters of mercury. Yes, CO2 is an acid, so you can rationalize it that way. As more CO2 is retained, pH will drop because CO2 is an acid. That's the respiratory acidosis over there. And so what's the compensation going to be? It's going to be renal compensation. Renal compensation would be to, remember, compensation is always in the same direction. And maybe we can talk about why that's the case right now, if I haven't already. So it's all due to the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, which you don't need to memorize, but it's useful to kind of know the relationship. The Henderson-Hasselbalch equation is pH equals to 6.1 over the log of the bicarbonate concentration divided by 0.03 times the PaCO2 in the standard unit. So that's in milliequivalents or millimoles per liter, and that's in millimeters of mercury. So it's really all about this equation. You plug in the values over here and you can figure out pH immediately. In fact, here's a little inside trick. All the problems that I posted on Blackboard, how do I know? I use the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. So I start off with two values and I can figure out the third value, but you need to know at least two values to get the third value, right? Typically, you measure bicarbonate, PaCO2, and then you can figure out what the pH is, or the other way around. It doesn't really matter. But the numbers have to fit the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. It's just not suddenly all made up. Anyways, so look at this. So in respiratory acidosis, PaCO2 is increased above normal, right? And if you know your simple arithmetic, despite the fact that it's log, it doesn't matter. But if the denominator now is increased, because PaCO2 is increased, this whole number over here, when you divide by a larger denominator, this number is going to become smaller. So this number is going to become smaller. The log of the smaller number will be a smaller number, and hence pH is going to go down, right? There's the inverse relationship that we see. pH is inversely related to PaCO2. As PaCO2 increases, pH will decrease, and vice versa. So anyways, so pH is decreasing. The only way we can compensate for it is to do what? Again, we want to get this. This is really, if we plug in the numbers, and we don't even need to do the log, just this value over here. What's the bicarbonate concentration? 24 milliequivalents. We'll just stick with one number, right? And in fact, we'll forget about the units as well. 0.03 times, what's PaCO2? If you said 40, you're right, over there. So now we can just do it this way. Oh, I have to do this properly in my head over here. So 0.3 times 40 is 12, 0.03, so that's 1.2, if I got that right. So 24 divided by 1.2, and that is 240 divided by 12, that is 20. The ratio has to be 20, as we can see. That's what you saw on the previous slide as well, one of them. The ratio of bicarbonate to PaCO2 is really carbonic acid, right? The ratio has to be 20 to 1 of bicarbonate to carbonic acid. That ratio has to be 20 to 1. That's bicarbonate, that's carbonic acid or CO2. Anyway, so if this increases, if you suddenly make it 2, then that number is going to be smaller, right? So let's just do, if the ratio is supposed to be 20 to 1, right? If you suddenly make CO2 double it, CO2 becomes 2, well, the only way that's going to stay the same number is to make this 40, right? That's basic math. So if you double this, you increase the denominator, the numerator also has to increase, right? So if you increase CO2, well, bicarbonate has to increase. That's the only compensation. The compensation is always in the same direction. Again, please refer to the other 2 videos where I explain this a little bit better over there. So the real compensation is all about adjusting by serum bicarbonate level. The bicarbonate levels are always in the same direction. If this has gone above normal, serum bicarbonate levels have to increase above 24 milliequivalents per liter. That's the only way you can get down to the same 20 to 1 ratio. Okay, right? So that's the etiology. What's the clinical manifestation of respiratory acidosis? Well, it has to do, all of the clinical manifestations have to do with the fact that you have dilation of the blood vessels in the brain. Because as CO2 increases, the brain is, CO2 is an acid, right? So now you're going to have CO2 build up in the brain, not good. So you need to get rid of more CO2. How do you get rid of? Well, you need to flush out the CO2. You need to have increased blood supply. So what CO2 does is that it causes vasodilation of the cranial blood vessels, dilation of the blood vessels in the brain, in other words. And that itself can lead to CNS manifestations such as headaches. It can cause somnolence, confusion, eventually papilledemia, as the intracranial pressure, as we see, will also rise. So various cardiac dysrhythmias or arrhythmias can develop as well. But the main clinical manifestations are neurological due to an increase in blood flow to the brain, which in turn can lead to increased ICP. So that is increased intracranial pressure, because increased blood flow eventually can lead to increased intracranial pressure. That can lead to all these neurological manifestations over there that we saw: headaches, blurred vision, tremors, vertigo, somnolence, etc. Okay, so that's respiratory acidosis. It's all due to vasodilation of the cranial blood vessels, neurological in nature. What about metabolic alkalosis? For metabolic alkalosis, the etiology could be, it's really a deficit of any acids, right? So we have pH for metabolic alkalosis, firstly greater than 7.4. What's the definition of metabolic alkalosis? A deficit of metabolic acids, right? Remember, it's not carbonic acid, it's not CO2. So when we have a deficit of all the other acids, metabolic acid, well, we don't need to buffer it, so serum bicarbonate levels have increased. There's a 21 to 1 ratio. Again, you don't need to know, but 6.1 plus the log of times PaCO2. Oops, let's hold it up. Okay, we need to make a big bracket here. Okay, so deficit of acid, which means that we don't, we're not buffering as much of the metabolic acids in the body. Serum bicarbonate levels start increasing, right? That's the definition. That's the ROME acronym. Again, ROME, metabolic equal, pH goes up, bicarbonate levels go up. In fact, it's because bicarbonate levels go up that pH goes up. Here, this goes up. This whole thing becomes, this whole factor becomes larger, pH will go above 7.4. Right, so by the way, the log of 20 is 1.3, or so 6.1 times 1.3 equals to 7.4. Nothing magical about here, that's just a mathematical relationship over there. Right, you can, if you don't believe me, you can break out your scientific calculator and figure it out. Plug in 24, plug in 40 over here, do the log, and you will see it's 7.4. Okay, anyways, so now bicarbonate levels have increased above normal because we have a deficit of the metabolic acids, or really metabolic acids. Then I guess I put down any, and there's a qualifier, but otherwise we could say deficit of metabolic acid. Carbonic acid and CO2 is not a metabolic acid. It's a volatile acid. So you have deficit of that, or it could be an increase in base. So if you take bicarbonate antacids, tons and tons of Tums, for example, that can cause also metabolic alkalosis over there. We won't talk about this ECF volume deficit over there. Anyway, so the definition is we have now too much bicarbonate, pH because of the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, increases above normal. What's the compensation? If you said the compensation is to, this is the numerator is increased, let's increase the denominator. Again, it's 20 to 1. Let's say the numerator is increased to 30. What can we do? We have to increase this also, the denominator, to 1.5 to make it back to a 20 to 1 ratio. So that's the only way that's the pH is going to go back to 7.4, or at least in the normal range. So that's the renal compensation. So that's the respiratory compensation. There's no renal compensation here because we already have too much bicarbonate. You can't say get rid of more bicarbonate. That's not going to happen over there. You could say the respiratory compensation is to increase PaCO2. How do we increase PaCO2? Hypoventilation. Okay, that's again on a sidetrack, but I don't know how many times we need to emphasize that. But what's the etiology of metabolic alkalosis? So we have a deficit of metabolic acids. That could be due to loss of HCl via emesis, so that's vomiting. It could be due to nasogastric suction. It can also be due to severe hypokalemia. Okay, now we mentioned this when we were doing the electrolyte imbalances. So here's a cell. Remember, in the cell we have lots of potassium and very little sodium. So that's the ICF. Outside the cell, the ECF, and remember ECF is plasma plus interstitial fluid, right? Eventually these two will become the same. The only difference in plasma, you have proteins, in interstitial fluid you don't have protein. So in the ECF we have very little potassium and lots of sodium. Okay, and in addition, we also have protons, right, in the plasma. That's what causes the acid. That's CO2, eventually, proton, all the metabolic acids, all proton. That's the acid part of it. Everything has to be in balance, homeostasis. Now, if you have severe hypokalemia, which means this has decreased even below normal, that can cause problems, right, and cardiac-related. Please refer to Unit 2 on all the electrolyte imbalances over there. You get flattened T waves, etc. over there. It's all cardiac-related. But now the body is going to try to help out. The cells will say, hey, there's less than normal amounts of potassium, and eventually cardiac manifestations can develop. So I'm going to push some potassium out of the cell. Isn't that going to help? Yeah, sure it's going to help. But there's a flip side over that. And maybe instead of drawing the H plus over there, let's draw the H plus over here. The charges are not balanced anymore. If you take out a potassium, well, you've got to balance the charge. You've got to take in another cation, but instead of stating in sodium, the way it works, it's because of the transporter. It's a potassium proton transporter, counter transporter. So potassium moves out of the cell to correct for the hypokalemia, and the proton moves into the cell. As the proton moves into the cell, this decreases, right? What is that? Alkalosis. So in severe hypokalemia, alkalosis can develop in this manner, where the cell potassium tries to shift out of the cell, and it does, and instead the proton shifts into the cell, moves from the ECF into the ICF, and that causes alkalosis over there. So that can be one other cause of metabolic alkalosis, severe hypokalemia. In metabolic alkalosis, the clinical manifestations are a little bit more subtle. There's really no absolute characteristic clinical manifestation. The key thing is to look at the client's history. That will be most helpful. So you look for vomiting, gastric drainage, etc., and that will give you a clue as to the etiology. Remember, that's one of the etiologies of metabolic alkalosis would be prolonged vomiting. But among the listed clinical manifestations would be an increase in neuromuscular excitability over there. So we're talking about tingling in the fingers and toes, and something similar to the clinical manifestations of hypocalcemia. But only in severe metabolic alkalosis does the clinical manifestations become a little bit more apparent. There you have CNS depression occurring, confusion, lethargy, eventually coma because of the increase in pH. The brain cells becomes dysfunctional over there. And in severe metabolic alkalosis, same thing with severe metabolic acidosis, death can occur as well. So we're talking about pH well up outside of the normal range, greater than 7.8, or in the case of acidosis, less than 7.2, 7.1. Let's move ahead and talk about respiratory alkalosis. In respiratory alkalosis, firstly, we had looked at the pH, and the pH is greater than 7.4. And the definition of respiratory alkalosis using the ROME acronym is then PaCO2 levels have increased. Oh, is it increased or decreased? Well, it's respiratory opposite, right? ROME. Have decreased below 40 millimeters of mercury due to hyperventilation. So essentially the etiology of respiratory alkalosis is anything that causes hyperventilation. And then as we see as over here, we simply have listed the box over here, but salicylate overdose and so forth. But you know what, let's just go through the various causes of hyperventilation. So anything that causes hyperventilation can result in respiratory alkalosis. Anxiety, PE or pulmonary embolism, everything related to the lungs here, pneumonia, asthma, as you're desperately trying to breathe in. So it's an inspiratory disorder over there. We'll talk about all these when we do the respiratory disorders in Unit 7. In sepsis, we have an increase in metabolic rate and hence an increase in ventilation as well. Hyperventilation occurs. In hypoxia, you're gasping for air. Hyperventilation occurs. And this is less common, in liver disease, for example, cirrhosis, hyperventilation can occur, and as a result, respiratory alkalosis. And lastly, in pregnancy. And the reason why in pregnancy respiratory alkalosis, or at least milder respiratory alkalosis, can develop is due to the effect of progesterone. In pregnancy, progesterone levels are sky high, and progesterone increases the ventilation rate, causes hyperventilation over there. lastly, medications, and we mentioned this a few times already. For example, salicylate toxicity. That's ASA, or acetyl salicylic acid. So any of these factors can cause respiratory alkalosis because hyperventilation is really the etiology over there. Too much CO2 is being exhaled over there. So before we go any further, what is the expected compensation? Expected compensation. To do that, there's one of two things you can do. You can either draw the little seesaw and rationalize this for yourself. So here we have the seesaw. Well, we have a problem with CO2. We're excreting too much CO2, so CO2 levels have dropped below normal. Nothing much we can do about that at this stage. The only other thing we can do is to adjust the metabolic acids over there. So since CO2 levels have dropped below normal, we want more of the metabolic acids. How do we get more metabolic acids? By buffering it less. So remember, it's the bicarbonate levels that determine the amount of metabolic acids. So if we want more metabolic acids, we need less buffer, less bicarbonate. So bicarbonate levels should be going down. So that's a real compensation. Decrease reabsorption of bicarbonate. In other words, bicarbonate excretion increases, right? And that's because we are excreting out less acid. We don't need to reabsorb as much bicarbonate over there. So that's the expected compensation over there. CO2 levels drop, bicarbonate levels drop. The other way to do it is to use the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, pH 6.1 plus log of, and we've written this a few times already, bicarbonate over 0.03 times PaCO2 over there. That has to be a 20-to-1 ratio. Log of 20 is 1.3, 6.1 by 1.3, 7.4. So we need to keep that 20-to-1 ratio of bicarbonate to carbonic acid or CO2. Over here now, in respiratory alkalosis, PaCO2 levels have dropped below normal. That denominator has become smaller. Overall, this will become larger. Log of the larger number is still a larger number. 6.1 plus a number larger than 1.3 will give you pH greater than 7.4. It's as simple as that. That's the mathematical relationship. So if bicarbonate levels if PaCO2 levels have dropped below normal, the only way this is going to go back down to a 20-to-1 ratio. So it should be a 20-to-1, right? That has become less than 1. So that's become 20 to, let's say it's even a half of it, 0.5. That becomes 40. Yeah, that's not good. So what can we do? Well, we have to reduce this. 10 divided by 0.5. Now that's 20. So this bicarbonate level has to come down. The compensation has to be in the same direction over there. So CO2 has come down, bicarbonate levels have to come down. And again, if you want to rationalize it, bicarbonate levels come down because you want to buffer less of the metabolic acid so that metabolic acids can come up to balance out the overall level of acids in our body. Right? So that's how we do it. Step by step, you can figure this all out rather easily. Step 1, pH. Step 2, use a row acronym. If it's respiratory opposite, if pH is greater than 7.4 and bicarbonate is less than 40, then it has to be, they're moving opposite direction, it has to be respiratory alkalosis. If CO2 is greater than 40, well, then that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? So it can be respiratory alkalosis over there. It'll have to be metabolic alkalosis, as we'll see if PaCO2 is greater than 40 and pH is greater than 7.4. Okay, so that's the etiology over there. Again, look at these. By the way, this is really why when you have someone who's suffering from anxiety and hyperventilating, why do you tell them to breathe into a brown paper bag, for example? What are we doing over there? You are re-inhaling the CO2. So that way you bring CO2 back up, because otherwise you're excreting out more and more and more CO2. Eventually, as we'll see in the clinical manifestations, eventually you will lose consciousness over there. So it's a really simple way of treating it, at least for anxiety. In the other cases, the treatment's got to be a little bit more involved. But if it's just a straightforward hyperventilation due to anxiety issues, then breathe into a brown paper bag and re-inhale the CO2 rather than just excreting out more and more CO2. Let's look at the clinical manifestations of respiratory alkalosis. Well, the clinical manifestations are really all related to the decreased cerebral vascular flow. So it's decreased, what am I writing here? Cerebral blood flow. And that's because the brain, as we saw in the case of respiratory acidosis, in respiratory acidosis, you want to increase blood flow through the brain because you want to wash away, so to speak, all the extra CO2. So acidosis causes vasodilation of the cranial blood vessels. In this case, alkalosis causes vasoconstriction of the cranial blood vessels. You have a decrease in cerebral blood flow. Uh-oh, what do you think is going to happen? Well, yeah, it's pretty obvious what will happen over there. All the symptoms are related to a decreased cerebral blood flow caused by vasoconstriction of the cranial blood vessel, lightheadedness, dizziness, anxiety, various paresthesias, numbness, eventually tetany, which sometimes is indistinguishable from hypocalcemia, and arrhythmias and so forth over there, right? So that's all that can occur, all due to decreased cerebral blood flow. Once more, as you can see, just like with respiratory acidosis, it's related to cerebral blood flow, right? It's all neurological symptoms in nature, most of them, aside from this increased neuromuscular excitability, which has to do with calcium levels, but we won't go into that. Okay, that's it. We went through metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis. We went through respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis. So just in summary, before we end the lesson, and it's a rather long lesson, but acid-base imbalances are very important. It's one of the favorite questions on the NCLEX exam. So if I were you, I would really learn this very well, especially in terms of solving the problems over there. Given the three values of pH, bicarbonate, start off with PaCO2, and serum bicarbonate levels, you should be able to diagnose the disorder, the primary disorder, and what the expected compensation would be. So you start off with defining an acid and a base. An acid is a proton donor, a base is a proton acceptor. Remember the buffers. The main buffer is bicarbonate, HCO3 minus over there. That's the main extracellular buffer over there. It's all about reestablishing homeostasis, 7.35 to 7.45. Please make sure that you remember all these normal values of pH, serum pH, PaCO2, and bicarbonate. This you get from an arterial blood gas sample, or ABG for short, over there, right? You have to request that. It has to be arterial. It can be venous. It's going to be different if it's venous. And then the serum bicarbonate level is 22 to 26. Remember, when solving for the problems, we work off a single value, 7.4 for pH, greater than 7.4, alkalosis, less than 7.4, acidosis. And similarly, when using the ROME acronym, you compare it to the pH. If pH is decreasing, if it's respiratory, then CO2 has to be decreasing as well. CO2 has to be increasing. It's respiratory opposite, right? Because CO2 is an acid. And similarly, if pH is decreasing, if it's metabolic, it has to be equal. Then for metabolic acidosis, at least, for metabolic acidosis, then bicarbonate levels have to be equal, decreasing as well, because it's buffering all the other metabolic acids. So please look at the etiology and clinical manifestations that we just went through, and then most importantly, please solve the acid-base imbalances problems. That's activity 2. There's 2 other videos. One video that shows you 4 examples and how to solve it step by step. Another video, which maybe you should watch even before that, is me writing kind of what I've been doing over here, but in a more systemic manner to explain all the core concepts. So If this video presentation of PowerPoint slide presentation hasn't helped, watch that other one. If you got it, great, you can skip that. But otherwise, watch the way I'm writing the notes, going a little bit more slowly, writing things down, and you can follow along to see the explanation and how things go. So once more, let's see, how do we identify if it's a respiratory or metabolic process by changes in PeCO2 and bicarbonate? So low pH, what does that mean? It's acidosis, right? First thing you write down is acidosis. Please don't go any further. Low pH is acidosis. Low bicarbonate, let's say. Low pH, acidosis, low bicarbonate. Ooh, both low. Use the Rome acronym. Metabolic equal. Ooh, that one's going down. That one's going down. It's metabolic. It has to be metabolic acidosis over there. Right? And the reason why bicarbonate is going down is because you have too much of all the other acids in the body over there, and it's buffering all the other acids, all the metabolic acids. You'll end up with metabolic acidosis. If you have, that's one. If you have low, you know what, let's not always do low. Let's do high pH plus high bicarbonate. Does that make any sense? High pH plus high bicarbonate? Well, okay, let's just take it step by step. High pH is firstly alkalosis. Right? High pH, definition of alkalosis. High bicarbonate. Okay, this has gone up. That has gone up. Ooh, metabolic alkalosis based on the Rome acronym. And that's because we have too little deficit of the metabolic acids. Hence, serum bicarbonate is not needed as much to buffer it. It increases. pH automatically increases as well. Metabolic alkalosis. Low pH plus high PaCO2. What does that mean? Low pH, that's going down. PaCO2 levels have gone up. That's because of hypoventilation over there. So because of hypoventilation, PaCO2 levels have increased. CO2 is an acid, pH comes down. But at the very least, you need to write acidosis, pH, right? Down. And ROME, respiratory opposite, respiratory acidosis. And lastly, we have high pH plus, that's gone up, low PaCO2, that's gone down. Why has it gone down? Because of hyperventilation, you've excreted out more CO2. Now pH automatically goes up because of the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, and hence what's happened? Well, first thing we need to do is this needs to be written out as alkalosis. It's high pH. And because of the Rome acronym, they're working in opposite direction. That's respiratory alkalosis. So that's just another way to determine this. We looked at several ways of approaching it. It doesn't matter which way you use, as long as you come to the right answer, but you can only come to the right answer if you understand all these concepts over there. So please make sure that you are able to identify whether it is a respiratory or metabolic process by changes in the PaCO2 and bicarbonate levels. And then next, you have to predict the compensatory response. Remember that the compensatory response is always in the same direction as the primary disorder in order to have the attempt to restoring pH. Since we're there, let's write down the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation to remind ourselves. Again, if you remember it, that's great, because then you know that the compensation always has to be in the same direction. So times PaCO2. Again, if you have your scientific calculator, you can prove it for yourself. Take 24 divided by 0.03 times 40. You will see that is 24, 0.03. I think I did this before. Whatever. Anyway, 24 divided by 0.03 times 40. Now 24 times, this is what? 0.12 over there, if I got my math correct over there. 3 times 0.4, yeah, and that's 240 divided by, that's 20 basically, right? 240 divided by 2, is it 1.2? I can even do that. Let's pull out the calculator over here. I don't know why I can't do this in my head over there. It's just late now at night over there. No, that's correct, but it should be 20. So that, you know what? Let's just pull it out. We'll keep the ink, and I know I'm wasting a little bit of time over here, but where's my calculator? Yeah, here's my calculator over there. So let's go over here. So 0.03, maybe we can solve the whole thing over here. just times 40 equals to, yes, there was where I got wrong. I can't even do the simple math in my head. So let's erase that. No. I have to go back over here. Oh, okay, things are not going very well officially. So where's the eraser? Let me go over here. Eraser. Why can't I close the eraser? Okay, never mind. Let's just cancel this. 40 times 0.03 is 1.2. We already established that, and that's equal to 20, right? So log of 20 basically comes down to pH. Remember, we are doing all this in order to establish that the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation is correct, and more importantly, to look at the compensation. Log of 20. What is log of 20? I can't do that in my head, but I know it's 1.3. But just to prove to you, is there we have it. But let's close this. Oops. Why do I have two of them? Okay, anyway, log of 20. There we go. Log 1.3. Waha! Didn't I tell you that? There. So 6.1.1.3. That much at least I can do in my head is 7.4. We're just rounding up everything over here. So the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation is correct. So in metabolic alkalosis, what do we have? Bicarbonate levels going down. The denominator going down. Sorry, numerator going down. Hence, denominator also has to go down. That's the only way you can maintain this ratio to be 20. So compensation has to be in the same direction, right? That's for its metabolic, so it can only be respiratory. Respiratory compensation, PaCO2 levels will have to go. That's going down. That has to go down as well. That's hyperventilation. Remember the cow-small breathing. For metabolic alkalosis, again, it has to be respiratory in nature. Here, in this case, bicarbonate levels have increased. PaCO2 levels will increase. Has to, in order to keep the 20-to-1 ratio. So respiratory compensation, PaCO2 levels will have to increase. That's hypoventilation. A little bit harder to actually see that in metabolic alkalosis, for example, but it's very easy to see the hypoventilation, the cow-small breathing. In respiratory acidosis, PaCO2 levels have increased above normal. Hence, bicarbonate will also have to increase. That's renal compensation. Renal compensation will reabsorb more bicarbonate. Bicarbonate levels have to increase because we have to buffer out all the other acids in the body over there, maintain the 20-to-1 ratio over here. And lastly, for respiratory alkalosis, it's obviously PaCO2 levels are decreasing. That's decreasing, denominator becoming smaller. Numerator also has to become smaller. So the kidneys will say, hey, we need more of the other acids in our body. We don't need as much buffer. Let's get rid of more bicarbonate levels. Serum bicarbonate levels are decreased. Okay, so this has been a rather long lesson, but I hope I've emphasized over and over again the different key points, and it might sound very repetitive, and if you understand this, I really apologize. The way to approach this is, once you get it, stop. Don't need to learn anymore, just practice the problems over there. But if you're having difficulty, either go through this again, or better still, come and see me. Hopefully I can take a different tack and make it a little bit more easier. Thanks for those of you that stuck around to the end. Sorry for all the interruptions and all these little things, niggling things that get in the way of doing a proper presentation. But hey, this is live, so I'm not going to edit it out. I think it's a little bit more fun. So hopefully you've learned a little bit. And again, if you're having any difficulty, email me, call me, come and see me in my office. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.
Besides the summary that you just saw, in this particular lesson, we went through the various buffer systems. So please remember, in terms of problem solving, you have to memorize these values for arterial pH, PaCO2, as well as bicarbonate concentration. We went through the various acid-base imbalances in terms of the etiology and clinical manifestations, specifically respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, and we also discussed the compensation for these specific acid-base imbalances. Remember that the focus really is on solving these problems, so please refer to the handouts that are given in class, the problem sets. There are also several more problem sets that are posted on the Blackboard site. Our next lesson is going to be our last lesson on the reproductive disorders. That's Unit 9. See you then. Thanks. Bye.